Now it's time to talk about large intestine. Recall that the small intestine, the last part of it, the ileum, extends out to the large intestine. And right here we have that ileocecal valve where the contents of the small intestine enter into the large intestine. This general region right here of the large intestine, that first segment of the large intestine, is referred to as the cecum, and attached to the cecum is this narrow extension of the large intestine. That's the appendix, this tiny appendix here. So food doesn't move down into the appendix typically. Food remains in the cecum and is propelled from the cecum up this direction. So food is going to be moving this direction up what we call the ascending limb of the colon, across the transverse colon, down the descending colon, through the sigmoid or S-shaped colon, into the rectum, the straight part of the lower intestine here, and then finally the anal opening, the anus at the end. So let's go ahead and label the parts of a large intestine. First of all, ileocecal valve. This is the cecum. Here's the appendix. This segment of the intestine right here is the ascending colon. The segment across here, from here to here, is the transverse colon. The segment here is the descending colon. This S shape that's bent or through here is the sigmoid colon. This is rectum, the straight part, and the opening here, anus. So those are the regions of your large intestine. Finish our tubular digestive system, the alimentary canal. Now let's talk about some specifics of the lining of the wall of the large intestine. Okay, here I'm working on a drawing of the lining of the large intestine. In the large intestine, we still have these glands. You can see a glandular pit coming down here, 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 here. So these are glands, intestinal glands, in the wall of the large intestine. They are surrounded mostly by goblet cells. There are still some enterocytes, so we have those two cell types in here. In the blue, we have the goblet cells, and where we don't have the blue, the little gaps. Those are the enterocytes, the absorptive cells of the intestine. The mucosal lining consists of these glands across here. There's a layer of smooth muscle just near the base of those glands. Here, this is the muscularis mucosa, the third part of the mucosa. And you recall the between the muscularis mucosa and the epithelium is where you would find the loose connective tissue components. There's not much room in this space between the glands for much connective tissue, but there's a little bit of lamina propria, that loose connective tissue in there. So we'll try to put a little bit of it in that gap between the intestinal glands here for this large intestine drawing. So between the glands we have loose connective tissue. There could be some blood vessels in there. There are no lacteals. You don't have the lymph supply. There are no villi that stick up off the surface here like we had in the small intestine. As you proceed down the small intestine, you accumulate more and more goblet cells. The ratio of goblet cells to enterocytes increases. So we have more in the ileum than we had in the duodenum. But by the time you get to the large intestine, there's many times more goblet cells than absorptive cells in the large intestine. So the mucosal lining consists of the epithelial cells that form the glands as well as the surface here. Consists of the lamina propria layer, the loose connective tissue, and the muscularis mucosa. Below that is going to be a layer of that dense, irregular connective tissue. This is submucosa. Now, in the last part of the small intestine, we had some of the lymphatic nodule clumps in the submucosa that we call Peyer's patches. But here in the large intestine, you may have individual lymphatic nodules to take up some of this space, but you won't find the groupings of lymphatic nodules in here. So there's a zone of that dense irregular connective tissue, the submucosa, and then out beyond that we have layers of muscle. There's the inner circular layer of muscle, and then the outer longitudinal muscle is thin in some places and then gets profoundly thick in other locations, and then it gets thin again, and so forth. There are 3 such thickenings of the longitudinal muscle along the length of your large intestine. They run like ribbon-like stripes on the outside of your large intestine, these thickenings of smooth muscle in the longitudinal layer. And these are referred to as the tinea coli, or coli, tinea coli. On the outside of your muscle layers, you have that last layer. There's a little bit of loose connective tissue in there, and then there's the epithelium, the mesothelial layer on the outside. I'll put in a little bit of that loose connective tissue in my picture, but then on the very outside there's the mesothelial layer. So let's talk about these layers one more time. First of all, there's the mucosa. Consists of the epithelium, lamina propria, and muscularis mucosa. The next layer right here is submucosa. Again, usually not much distinctive about that layer. In some places you may see a lymphatic nodule crop up. Next, I'll just label this right through here, not try to do anything artistic with it. This is the inner circular layer. And this is your outer longitudinal layer. Together, those 2 layers make up your muscularis externa. And this thickening of the longitudinal layer of muscle that extends along the length, like I said, in 3 different bands. This is just one band. It's called tinea coli. Tinea coli. Finally, we have the outside layer that is a serosa. The serosal membrane consists of a little bit of loose connective tissue and the mesothelium on the very outside. I apologize for writing where you're down where you couldn't see, so let's go over this just a little bit more. So here's our outer layers of muscle, smooth muscle, or muscularis externa, has an inner circular layer, an outer longitudinal layer. That thickening of the outer longitudinal layer here will be labeled the tinea coli, and then finally your loose connective tissue and mesothelial layer forming the serosal membrane on the outside. Just a few other points I wanted to make regarding the small and large intestine before we move on to the liver, pancreas, and gallbladder topics of digestive system. Here I've drawn a cross-section of the large intestine, the colon, through here, just to go back to the idea of the tinea coli that are longitudinal bands that occur in 3 different parts. So I thought it'd be nice to have a cross-section here that showed the different thickenings around the outside that we called tinea coli on the outside, those longitudinal bands. Now recall that the small intestine is there primarily for the absorption of nutrients, so we need to get most of our food molecules broken down into their smallest chemical elements by both the physical mixing of the food and the chemical enzyme digestion of those food molecules so that they can be absorbed into the cells of the small intestine. When we get to the large intestine, we're still going to have some absorption of the food. We're going to have a lot of absorption of the water. We're going to remove the water content from the food here. But bacteria occupy much of the large intestine. The bacteria aid in the final stages of our digestion. So there are some things that can be digested by the bacteria that we wouldn't otherwise be able to process. And they also produce some of our B vitamins and vitamin K that are important to us. So there's some vitamin production, there's some final digestion that's accomplished by bacteria in the large intestine as we go on through there. But no enzymes are added by glands or other structures in that portion of the intestine, in the large intestine. Finally, at the very end of the rectum, there's a thickening of that circular layer of muscle, where it remained fairly constant in thickness throughout most of the large intestine. It thickens there. It's a internal anal sphincter. So there's internal anal sphincter, and then there's a skeletal muscle, voluntary muscle, to the outside of that, beyond that, that is a voluntary anal sphincter. So there's an involuntary inside, a smooth muscle, and then voluntary outside of that, that is skeletal muscle at the end of your digestive system.